Hello everybody and welcome back to ENG 3033 Introduction to the Study of World Literature. This is a short video to introduce your next minor assignment, which is an audio-video response to An Image of Africa, Racism in Heart of Darkness by Chinua Achebe, and to Edward Said's Two Visions in Heart of Darkness. At this point, you've already had a discussion forum on this topic, and I was really pleased to see that the new format of the discussion forum seemed to lend itself to better discussion, better interaction between you as students, and especially more willingness to challenge one another on your stances in relation to these texts. One of the things that I think people did very well on was interpreting Chinua Achebe's essay and coming to terms with how his reading of the text is rooted in experience and how his interpretation of the text challenges just the notion of the book as great literature, that it can be forgiven a lot of sins because it's great literature or because it's of its time. I think people were clearly more challenged by the Said essay. It was quite clear that some people struggled to get their head around what he was trying to do, which is fine. I want to reiterate something that I said in the last video, which is that his emphasis here is on the narrative structure of the novel and the way that the framing narrative in particular causes us to reinterpret the meaning of what's going on in the text. I think that some people, when they were reading it, misinterpreted what Said is saying and took him to mean that he is maybe giving his approval to imperialism itself, that for Said this is an imperialistic novel and that's a good thing. And that's very much not what Edward Said is saying. Edward Said is the father of post-colonial criticism, which is a field of criticism that seeks to show how particularly Western literature is built on principle that, let's say, ideas of Western civilization are created only through defining people from other parts of the world, whether that's the Far East, the Middle East, the Global South, as innately inferior to white Western men. And Said is very much not the kind of person that you would expect to give his approval to an imperialist worldview. What he's saying about this novel is that it embodies an imperialist worldview, that Achebe is correct to some extent in identifying this as a racist novel, that it embodies racist views. But Said goes a step further and says that's not all it's doing. That by framing Marlowe's narrative as somebody telling a story to a group of British businessmen on a boat who are very much attuned to the question of colonialism, Conrad is drawing attention to the fact that this is a story for colonizers, that it is shaped to agree with the worldview of people who hold this view of the rest of the world. And while Conrad himself may be bound up in that imperial project, he's still conscious enough of the limitations of that worldview, the idea that there is a different way of seeing the world, that imperialism doesn't define how we can see the world. And in other words, the apparent racism of the novel is shaped or framed by this bigger narrative. And so we need to pay attention to the fact that Marlowe, we're not being asked, Said argues, just to agree with Marlowe. It doesn't invite us to do that. Instead, it's asking us to think about the limitations of Marlowe's perspective. And that's the difference, I think, between Said and Achebe. They both agree that the novel contains a lot of racial stereotyping. But for Said, he feels that it's possible that the novel gestures towards a different way of viewing the world. Whereas for Achebe, this is Marlowe's a racist, Conrad is a racist, and that's it. We're supposed to agree with Marlowe. For Said, he says Marlowe is a racist. However, Conrad has a difficult relationship with colonialism, partly because he's a Polish immigrant himself, whose personal and family history is affected by a different form of colonialism and doesn't have a very simple relationship with the racist attitudes that Marlowe expresses, and that difficulty is contained in the narrative structure. Even though Said does point out, the novel doesn't portray an alternative way of viewing the world. It just acknowledges that there may be another way of viewing the world, that it understands the limitations of its own perspective. This is not an omniscient realist novel. It's one that's very carefully limited in that way. So I want to make sure that when people are interpreting Said in your audio or video responses, that you make sure to acknowledge that limitation that he's placing on what the novel is trying to do. And if you're having trouble with it, certainly get in touch with me, but don't give up on the text after a single reading. Literary criticism, especially theoretical criticism like this, is hard. It takes time to work your way through an essay and try to understand it sentence by sentence. I think you need to persevere with that. Declaring it less persuasive than Achebe is absolutely fine. I don't agree, but it doesn't really matter whether I agree with you or not on that. But it's not enough to say, well, I didn't understand it and therefore it's not as good as Achebe's work. It's necessary also to be able to identify what exactly Said is arguing in the first place and take issue with him based on what he's really arguing. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to say was just to go through the prompt, and I'm looking at it right here. The first step that you're taking here is to summarize the two arguments, right, in your own terms. And so make sure to briefly describe how they build their argument, not just what they're arguing, which I've just discussed with Said, but also how do they try to persuade their reader? Do they appeal to reason? Do they use facts? Do they use sufficient evidence? Do they appeal to our emotions? I think it's fair to say that these are not just arguments that are entirely built on logic, but they may also be attempting to affect our feelings or draw upon our very strong emotions in relation to these issues. And pay attention to their word choice, their use of anecdotes, for example. Achebe draws not just on the text, he also talks about his personal experience and how that informs his understanding of this type of literature. How do they establish their own credibility, right? So we're talking about it as rhetoric. How do they build their argument, not just what do they argue? And I want to make sure that you're emphasizing that in that first part of what you're doing in the summary of your understanding of these essays. And then you move on to say which one you think is more persuasive or compelling. Now, you don't have to take a very simple, like this one's better or this one's better approach, but you do need to ultimately take a stance that you find one or other to be more persuasive, but you can have a sort of complex, nuanced look at both of them. One of them doesn't have to be totally wrong and the other doesn't have to be totally right. For one thing, as I've mentioned, they do broadly agree with one another on some issues. You might find that you find both of them to be incorrect or both of them to be wrong. If you feel that way, then say it. I think that that's a good idea, but you need to be able to draw on textual evidence yourself to show why they're incorrect. And that goes for whatever stance you take. The important thing is that you do have a stance. The couple of things in terms of presentation. Now, as you may have gathered, I'm not terribly good at presenting videos myself, so I'm certainly not in a position to judge the quality of your editing skills or your presentational skills necessarily. And that's not what this assignment is trying to do. If you look at the prompt, you'll find that the three major categories that you get your points from are critical engagement with the texts, insightfulness of central argument, and communication. So your ability to communicate your ideas effectively on video or in audio only accounts for 10 points, right? I would mention that doesn't mean that you're not stumbling over your words, or that everything is very smoothly presented. As you can see, I'm not terribly good at smoothly presenting my ideas. What I'm interested in is that you generally communicate your ideas effectively and clearly, and more importantly, that you've structured your presentation in a way that unfolds logically, that it's easy to follow how you're presenting your ideas. In other words, that there is a plan, right? That you maybe begin by summarizing the two arguments, explaining the nuances of them, and then moving on to take a stance in relation to those essays and arguing your case effectively. That's what the communication grade is given by, not necessarily by how polished your speaking voice is or how good your editing techniques are. I'm not terribly interested in any of that. I'm interested in your ability to convey your ideas in a way that's structured and logical. The other points are given for content. So critical engagement with the text means that you engage in an insightful, critical way with both essays, that you closely analyze them for insights that they provide into Heart of Darkness. In other words, it would not be enough in terms of getting an exemplary grade for critical engagement to talk just about how confusing or difficult you find one of the essays. It's okay to acknowledge that, and especially if you think that Said, for example, is less persuasive because of the difficulty of it, that's okay. But ultimately you do need to engage with the substance of his argument and try to come to terms with what that is, even if you disagree with it strongly. So the critical engagement with the text forms as much of your grade as the communication the communication grade. The final part of that grade is made up of the insightfulness of your central argument. So what's necessary here is, first of all, that you have a central argument, not just which essay you find more compelling, but why you find it more compelling, that allows you to build on the insights the texts provide, so that you're not just saying, well, this is what this person stands for, and this is what Said stands for, and this is what Achebe stands for, and I think Achebe is better, and moving on, but rather that you build upon the insights of these two essays, or you provide an alternative perspective on Heart of Darkness. So just like the discussion forums, it's not enough to agree with somebody. You need to agree but build upon it, or you can disagree and provide an alternative perspective. And if you're doing those three things, if you engage critically with the substance of both essays, you clearly show an understanding of how they build their argument and what their central argument is. If you take a clear and insightful stance in relation to the essays and build on it and show an engagement with the texts, and finally, if you allow that argument to unfold in a clear and logical way, then you will get an A on this. If you're missing any of those elements, if your stance is not clear, or if you don't necessarily build on your stance in relation to the two texts, then you'll maybe get a B. By the same token, if your engagement with the text doesn't really clearly identify the major points of argument being made, for example, or show a clear understanding of what kind of argument they're trying to make, then maybe also you might get a B. If your argument doesn't unfold very logically, or it's not clear how you're building your argument, again, you might get a B. And if all of those things are happening at once, if you don't have a clear argument, don't critically engage with the text, don't logically unfold that argument, then you probably get a C or maybe a D. Okay, so I hope that's all clear. What I would say is that I understand that it can be awkward making these videos. You've seen mine, so you understand that I understand. So don't worry about that part of it. This is just the reason we do this as an audio video thing as opposed to writing, is mainly to give you an opportunity to convey your ideas and communicate your ideas in a different format that maybe some people are more comfortable in one way as opposed to writing, and also to give you a chance to communicate using other modes of communication, so that you can incorporate things like body language, gesture, tone of voice. If you want to incorporate slides or graphics or video or whatever, then you're more than welcome to do that as well. The idea is to make sure that people are not confined just to writing in terms of how they communicate their ideas. So I hope it's a productive engagement with the text. In the meantime, you're also beginning to read Vlad this week by Carlos Fuentes. If you have any questions about that text as you're reading through it, let me know. I'm not going to provide any sort of background on it beyond the fact that this is a rewriting of Dracula, or a transposition of the character of Dracula from 19th century Romania and England to modern day Mexico City. And I'm interested in what you think of that transposition. Why would a writer from Mexico like Carlos Fuentes, why would he engage with a character from 19th century European Gothic fiction, and what kind of story does that allow him to tell about modern Mexico City? It may be at times a slightly disturbing book if you're easily scared or easily, especially if you have any kind of discomfort with the content or anything like that, feel free to contact me and we can find a workaround. But for most people, it should be an enjoyable read. I think it's a fun book in its own way, but it can be pretty dark and pretty unnerving at times. So let me know how you're getting on with it. I hope it's enjoyable. It is a short book as well, so there is that. So other than that, enjoy the remainder of your spring break. I look forward to talking to you all next week. See you soon. Bye.